Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists has conducted an investigation that can hardly be called truly sensational. But if this is, in fact, a sensation, then it is at least several centuries old, and it lies in a fundamental and rather simple truth. Everywhere Russia goes, it must be said, without exception, it brings into existence a gulag. Some export flowers, others their cuisine, and some export prisons and camps filled with torture and humiliation. This time we're talking about Africa, about Mali. Journalists have discovered that the so-called private military company Wagner, which of course has always been nothing more than a branch of the Russian security services, has established an entire network of secret prisons in these African country prisons that even the Malian military, who used Russian support to stage a coup and seize control of their own country, could not influence. Eyewitnesses report that Wagner operatives set up prisons in a number of cities across the country, which they essentially controlled. Some of these prisons are even located on official Malian military bases, once again with no access whatsoever for Malian army officers or the country's own leaders to what is happening there. Wagner operatives establish prisons almost everywhere they go. At the same time, former inmates of these prisons recount a whole range of torture methods used by killers from Prigozhin's military company. Beatings with electric cables, waterboarding, metal containers left under the scorching African sun, electric shocks, forced labor, and starvation torture. And by the way, I think it will be especially interesting, in particular for all fans of the Russian world, to know that Wagnerites, as a rule, perhaps even typically, tortured prisoners to Russian music. So greetings to Iosif Kobzon, Babkina, and Dima Bilan. Their work is, so to speak, in demand, out of necessity. And this too can truly be called a genuine export of culture. We've always wondered, what's the point of Russian pop music? Why do we need all this chanson music, all these Shufutinskys and other well-known performers of songs about a hard and difficult life? It's so that to the sound of these familiar songs recognizable to every resident of the Russian Federation and the surrounding regions, people can be tortured with hunger, subjected to electric shocks, or even beaten with sticks. And by the way, so that the sounds of torture and suffering aren't so easily heard outside the thick prison walls, so that the cries of the unfortunate prisoners can be heard. So you could say that Russian culture has finally found its remarkable refuge in the torture chambers and prisons on the territory of Mali. And of course, the fact that Russia has set up a gulag in Mali is yet another reminder of the consequences of Russia's arrival wherever it may go. What is happening in Africa is strikingly reminiscent of the actions of the Russian state after the occupation of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, and later Kherson and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine. The same systematic abductions, the creation of covert, secret, and later completely open prisons, physical and psychological torture, torment, psychological suffering, and abuse. The infamous Izolyatsiya concentration camp in the Donetsk region became especially notorious. And by the way, let's recall again, the bandits who are mercenaries of Russia on this blood-soaked Ukrainian land turned the former contemporary art center into a concentration camp, because that is exactly how they perceive art and culture. And I think there is nothing surprising about that either. And of course, it's also worth mentioning that such actions perfectly illustrate just how much Russia cares about the opinions of its puppets. In the occupied territory of Donbass, the Kremlin's mercenaries had virtually no access to the operations of the Federal Security Service and the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. These were their handlers, and if they detained anyone themselves, of course, the puppet authorities had no influence whatsoever over the fate of those arrested. They could only deal with those whom they themselves had kidnapped and detained. The same thing is happening in Mali. Secondly, there are arrests and detentions for ransom. In fact, ever since the Chechen War, Russian military forces have turned the kidnapping of people who often have absolutely no connection to political activity into a means of enrichment. This was the case with ordinary civilians in Chechnya. This continued during the war in Ukraine. We found out that the same thing is happening in Mali when ordinary herders or traders are arrested in order to force their families to pay ransom to the Wagner fighters. Another absolutely obvious and unmistakable sign of lawlessness is quite clearly that the leadership of the Wagner military company can in fact act entirely on its own, detaining whomever it deems necessary, without regard for anyone else. It can even create an entire penitentiary network that is practically unaccountable to either the authorities of Mali or the leadership of the Russian Federation itself. Just the other day, a statement was made that the Wagner Group has completed its mission in Mali. But let's not delude ourselves into thinking that the secret prisons of the private military company will disappear from the territory of this African country. No, since there is an African contingent operating in Mali, the overwhelming majority of whom are former Wagner mercenaries, I have no doubt that all these prisons will be taken over by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, so to speak, on an official basis. And in the same way, no one will take the Malian leadership into account. And in the same way, these prisons will now be used to enrich ordinary Russian officers or Wagner members who will be presented as Russian military personnel. Because as long as you don't drive Russia out from wherever it is, it will continue to maintain the Gulag as the best and most important form of its own civilization. And of course, to play songs by Joseph Kobzon or Mikhail Shufutinsky in this Gulag in order to showcase the full might of one's own cultural achievements and to silence the screams and cries of those being beaten, tortured, and starved. Thank you, friends. Subscribe to this channel. Social media and support links are below. Use the sponsorship feature on YouTube. Peace to all.